This is Real in the Field Goals, another episode of the weekly Seahawks podcast where myself, Kenneth Arthur, and Danny Kelly from fieldgoals.com sit down and talk about the Seahawks and what's going on in the world of the Seattle Seahawks. And this week, our guest, well, who could be closer to the world of the Seattle Seahawks than John Boyle himself of Seahawks.com, covering the team for the team for just about a year now, going into a second season after 6 years at the Everett Herald. John, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on, guys.
Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time and coming in. You know, the Seahawks coming off of, a playoff loss, I guess, against the Panthers, and the Broncos coming off of their Super Bowl win, a little bit of a surprise. I think a lot of people would have liked to see how the Seahawks could have done both against the Cardinals and the Broncos. So they're thinking about the future. They're thinking about next year, obviously, free agencies going around with what players could be leaving and with what players could be going in. I guess a lot of people focusing on the draft. When you were at the Combine just recently, what was your overall impression of this year's scouting Combine?
You know, it's funny. Danny and I were talking about this at the Combine. It didn't have, like, really the star power. You didn't have your, Jameis Winston, Marcus Mariota. So it maybe isn't going to be the flashiest draft in that standpoint. But everyone you talk to, whether it's the draft analysts or guys with different teams, they like the depth of this draft, which, when you're a team like the Seahawks pretty consistently drafting late and in each round, and they tend to stockpile some mid-late round picks, this could be a really good draft for them in terms of finding good value.
What was, this was your first Combine, you said, when we were talking over there in Indianapolis. Did you have an interesting moment or anything like that kind of stood out to you of all the kind of weirdness that happens there?
Nothing too crazy. It is, to me, it's just kind of funny. It going into it, but when you actually see it, it's like just the fact that everyone's there. I mean, you drive or you walk down the street. It's funny. We were like on our way into the hotel, and you see Bruce Arians walking into St. Elmo's at 4 in the afternoon. You just, it's just pretty much any important NFL person, agent, just they're all there, media. So it is just the best place to connect, and everyone's networking. I mean, you get agents networking with executives, you get media people networking. So it's an interesting, I mean, it's almost, to me, the bigger thing is not the actual combines, what's going on the field, the player evaluation, but just all the other things. Schneider mentioned it. They're talking free agency with all these different agents. So much gets done there outside of what happens at Lucas Oil Stadium.
Yeah, I was actually, it's funny that you mentioned St. Elmo's. I was walking past St. Elmo's, and Rex Ryan came out, and he kind of made a beeline right in front of me. I literally had to stop. So I got cut off by Rex Ryan walking down the street. So it's kind of weird. It's surreal. We were actually sitting at the Yard House, one of the places downtown in Indianapolis, and just 10 feet away from us, it's Chip Kelly and Trent Baalke having beers. And it's just a weird kind of surreal experience. But at the same time, I mean, when you go to the actual Combine, it's there's all these guys here. So it's not I don't get why seeing them on the street is any different. It just kind of feels funny because you just hey, this person's extremely famous. I just ran into them. But yeah.
My favorite story.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was saying my favorite story isn't my own, but Brian Pan, our video guy who was there, went out to get a shake and a burger at what's the chain out there?
The Shake and Steak.
Yeah,
Steak and Shake. Yeah.
And both the Ryan brothers were there at midnight. I'm like, that's just perfect.
Yeah, I actually did see. I went to the Shake and Steak as well at I think it was 11 p.m. or something the first day I got there, and I won't name names, but there was a member of the Seahawks scouting department in the Shake and Steak. So it is funny. It's just kind of everyone's there. It is kind of weird.
Yep.
Never steak, but I've heard good things. And the local product, the Huskies standout. He was also perhaps the winner, some would say, at the Combine. Really, boosted his stock quite a bit, it seems. And talking with the players, and I think, and with teams, and I think that a lot of people are going to want to see a marriage between the Seahawks and Feeney. Obviously, not only is that a long shot, just in the basis of any player, certain player going to the Seattle or any team is sort of a long shot. But what are your impressions of Travis Feeney?
Yeah, I mean, I've watched him just, as a casual fan in college and always thought he was a pretty good player, but he really turned some heads with what he ran a 4.5 flat. He jumped well. So, and great kid by all accounts. We sat down and talked with him for a while and was, great interview and all that. So, if Bruce Irvin were to leave in free agency, all of a sudden strong side linebacker is a need. And that's what Feeney said he sees himself fitting best. So obviously, local kid, as you said, everyone's going to want to connect those dots. But when you're talking about, whether he's a mid to late round guy trying to hit on that with 32 teams, it's impossible to project. But sure, I can see it where fans might like that possible fit, and it could be a need. But yeah, it's way too hard to know if that could actually come to fruition.
When you were talking to him, so you asked him kind of where he fit best. Do you think he could be kind of like a sub-package rusher too, kind of like how Bruce Irvin moves over and rushes the passer on third down?
Yeah, I haven't watched enough of him to know that well. I don't think he's – I would feel safe saying he's not the caliber of rusher Bruce Irvin is, because Bruce Irvin was middle of the first-round pick, and that's not going to be Freeney. But – the fact that he played all over in college, he went there as a safety. He was a linebacker standing up, behind the line of scrimmage. He was on the line of scrimmage as a pass rusher more so last year. So sure, he can do it. I don't know, how good of he's pretty lean. I don't know how good of a pass rusher he is in the NFL, but he's got the speed to do it. And, in a pinch, you could put him in there. But, I do get a hunch that, Bruce Irvin's such a rare athlete. If he does leave, I almost think you kind of have to fill his role with two players. You need a situational pass rusher and a linebacker, and maybe one or two of those is both on your team. Maybe you plug, obviously Frank Clark's going to play more. You could play Cassius Marsh more. Maybe you find someone else who's out there as a situational pass rusher. But I don't think it's fair to very many human beings on this earth to expect them to be the athlete that Bruce Irvin is.
You guys were talking earlier about, coaches and GMs and the types of people in charge of organizations at the combine, as well as their eating and drinking habits. But as far as just the characters and personalities, with Pete Carroll and John Schneider, like what would you say that they are atypical of the normal head coach, general manager? Would you say? Obviously, what they've done is very successful, and you'd think there is something atypical about guys like that, or would you say they're pretty much just normal guys?
Well, that's a hard one to answer because I've been covering only that team since they've been here, so I only see everyone else from afar. But yeah, they don't, especially Pete. John Schneider is, personality-wise, he's a really fun guy, and he's, a great guy to just talk to. But I think he might fall into sort of the more traditional, what you expect an NFL scout to be, who was just really good at his job and climbed the ladder, and now he's one of the best GMs in football. Pete Carroll is definitely unique. The way he does things, the way he approaches the game, certainly not the, traditional hard-nosed, yelling at guys kind of coach, and he's made it work incredibly well. To me, what's most unique isn't necessarily either of them individually, but what they've built together. And I pretty vividly remember when they put this all together, and Todd Lewicki talked about, he used the term fantastic collaboration. And I think all of us in the media at the time kind of rolled our eyes and thought it sounded a little hokey. But that to me is about the most important thing that caused the Seahawks to be what they've been over the last few years, is how well those two work together. You just don't really have a lot of egos in this building. And it's been a pretty cool thing to see how well it's all come together between the two of them. And conversely, you can find plenty of examples around the league where you don't have a good coach-GM relationship and how bad that can be.
Yeah, speaking of John Schneider, you got to have an exclusive with him at the Combine. I think you did kind of a walk and talk with him at one point. And that interview went up at Seahawks.com today. Or actually, it's been up a little while, but now you guys are kind of pushing it again today. What was one thing that kind of stood out about that interview with John Schneider? Did anything he say kind of stick out to you?
There are a couple things, but what really, we've kind of noticed this before. I think anyone, you guys and anyone who's paying attention, but talking to him a little more about it was interesting. Is this idea of, it's not so much just talent evaluation, it's market evaluation as well, because everybody can know who's good and who you like and who might fit your system, but it's knowing where a guy's going to go and then really kind of sticking to your guns. And obviously the best example of that is Russell Wilson. They loved him, and maybe there was some temptation to just say, look, we like this guy, let's not mess around and get him in the second round. Well, if you do that, now you don't have your all-pro middle linebacker. So the ability to not just know who you like, but where you can actually wait to get them. And, that goes for, Doug Baldwin. They had 4th, 5th round grade on him is what Schneider said. Thomas Rawls, they had draftable grade on him. But it's knowing, hey, we like this guy. And as Danny and I talked about, sometimes you might want to draft a guy, but there might be somebody you don't think you can sign in free agency. So you draft that guy in the 7th round and wait to sign a Doug Baldwin. And then that applies to free agency. I think it's why we've seen the Seahawks not be very aggressive necessarily on those first couple days, or at least not sign guys on those first couple days. We don't always know who they're talking to, but it's, okay, we're not going to get caught up in the feeding frenzy and overbidding, but wait, see how the market is and identify, okay, Michael Bennett's still out there. He's not making probably what he should have, and now we're going to get him as a steal of a price. They've filled some holes, especially defensive line, by waiting and just finding the good value.
Yeah, that was kind of to go further into what we were talking about at the Combine. John and I had an interesting conversation about how sometimes it seems like the Seahawks draft really random people at the end of the draft, like 6th, 7th round. You're like, okay, this guy was ranked 978th on NFL draft.scout.com or whatever. But at the same time, you kind of have to wonder what was the reasoning for that, because it doesn't seem like anything is random with the Seahawks. So what we talked about was, if the Seahawks have a position group that if they think they can't get a certain position group in undrafted free agency. So for instance, like last year or the year before, maybe they didn't think that running back was a position that they would be able to get because they had, Marshawn Lynch, Robert Turbin, Christian Michael. And so any free agent running back is going to look at that and be like, okay, I'm not going there. So sometimes, and that is maybe a bad example because they did get Rawls last year, but I think sometimes they look at those and say, we're going to draft the player or the position groups that we think we won't be able to get in undrafted free agency and then wait and sign guys. So I think that's kind of, to go further into what John had mentioned there, is kind of how they do the whole undrafted free agency versus the late round picks. And so that's a pretty interesting angle. I think that you have to kind of keep in mind as the draft goes on this year. Going back a little bit, I know that you guys talked to a lot of the local players for Seahawks.com at the Combine. Who are some of the guys that you guys focused on and kind of what stood out with those guys?
Yeah, I mean, we touched on Feeney and also his teammate, Corey Littleton. Those guys are similar in a lot of ways, that they've kind of played all over, and that versatility could help them out. Littleton's probably not going to have as high a draft stock as Feeney is, just maybe not quite as good at athlete measurables wise, but another good kid, really committed to special teams, which is going to help him out. Locally, not necessarily local colleges, but just guys from the area. Miles Jack from Bellevue, we all know a lot about him. Obviously, he's probably going to be top 5, top 10 pick. Just incredible athlete coming off the injury. So there's some questions there, but I don't think that's going to hurt him much. And then Josh Garnett as a guard that, it's funny, again, this is coming from no insight on anything internally, but he just, when you talk to him, he sure sounds like a Seahawks type player, a Tom Cable type guy, just that tough, smart, what do they always say? They want tough, smart, and aggressive, or
tough, smart, reliable.
Tough, smart, and reliable.
Yeah.
I should know this. But yeah, tough, smart, reliable. And he just kind of checks all those boxes. The one that really kind of caught my attention, he used a term that, when he blocks guys, he wants to run through their soul. So the idea of just not just knock a guy over, but he wants to really make them feel it. So I like that guy a lot. He was
one of the guys that actually said the Seahawks met. He met with the Seahawks. I think he was like one of the only guys I heard say that.
Yeah, well, I think what's smart, the way they have it set up, is generally the players meet with the media before their meetings. So the players don't have to disclose. I mean, they don't have to anyway, but they can. It gives them an easy out. If a media guy asks who have you met with, they can say, I don't know, we haven't done it yet. So, another guy though, Joe Dahl from Wazoo. From what I understand, he seemed to help himself. Maybe showed a little more athleticism than people gave him credit for, and he, like so many linemen, we could talk all day about this, but he's facing that question of, can he go from a spread offense where he's almost never even in a 3-point stance to a more traditional NFL offense, which, this opens up the whole conversation about less prepared offensive linemen, all that stuff coming into the league.
Exactly.
To quote your own interview with John Schneider, he talks about how they look for the psychological aspects of players at the combine. And when they talk, like you guys are talking with Josh Garnett, and he said that they have to make sure they can overcome to make it at our level. What does quote unquote our level mean for the Seahawks? Do they not think most players can cut it with their team?
A couple of things, but to me, a lot of times when I read that or hear that kind of stuff, it goes along with when you hear John Schneider talk about like with the interview process, and he says one of the hardest things about scouting is knowing what's in a man's heart, and it's pretty easy to look how fast this guy is, how well he catches the football, how well he throws the ball, but just sort of the attitude, their love of the game, and I mean, there's a lot of big personalities in that Seahawks locker room, and powerful personalities, and guys that Earl Thomas is one of the most intense human beings you will ever see or meet, and if that works for you and you're his teammate and you guys get along well, you're probably going to say he's the best teammate you've ever had. If you have a hard time with that kind of intensity, you might not like it, and it might be hard for you to fit in. And I mean, think about all the alpha males in that secondary alone. That could be a hard group to just fit into. So I think that's part of what they look at is, can you fit in with a secondary like Seattle's? Can you fit in with the Tom Cable line where, Tom Cable is going to be very demanding and ask certain things of you. So it's, I think a lot of just what they're trying to figure out is, okay, we like what you can do running and jumping and catching and, just all the physical stuff, but are you going to fit in this locker room and kind of be a part of what we have building here?
I'm not going to say that losing Bruce Irvin and Russell Okung in free agency would mean it was a leadership vacuum or anything like that. But if that does happen, obviously they're both free agents and could be highly sought after in free agency. If they both left, what kind of personalities are the Seahawks losing there? And do you have any kind of idea of what types of players might step in those roles? I know that Irvin and Okung probably have different kind of personalities in the locker room, but
yeah.
What would you think of that?
Yeah. I mean, I'll start with Irvin because I don't think I don't want this to come across as slight to Irvin, but I don't think it's as big a loss personality-wise because he was never asked to really lead that group.
Right.
I'm not saying he couldn't, and I know that's sounding a great player. Guys love him in that locker room, and he's a big part of things. But when you look at that group, kind of Bobby Wagner, he's the captain. He was more. It comes with that position. The middle linebacker's kind of asked to lead. But when you go to Okung, if he were to leave, you're talking about a guy who's been a starter on that offensive line for 6 seasons, and along with Sweezy, the only two guys with a whole lot of experience. And Sweezy's a free agent too. So, if Okung left and Sweezy stayed, you ask Sweezy to kind of step in and be the leader of that line. But if they do lose Okung, that's a big leadership hit because you talk to all those young guys, the Gilliams, Britt, all those guys, they've really looked up to him as a guy that's kind of been, especially since Max Unger left. I mean, it was kind of Unger's line. He leaves, passes the torch. I mean, it happens every position, everywhere in the NFL. It's just the nature of the league. So if he's going to move on, then someone else is just going to have to fill that void.
There seems like there's so much talk about the Seahawks offensive line too, and more so it seems than other teams, perhaps because of the errors that they make, or the fact that the Russell Wilson was getting sacked so much early in the season, and then they had to switch out Drew Novak, or even if it's just because they're not afraid to take guys from the defensive side and move them over to the offensive side and work that angle. Obviously, they still got Christian Sicoli sort of going through that program, and we don't know where he's going to be at. But as far as the Seahawks heading into the offseason and not knowing for sure, like, who the 5 starters are going to be next year, like, how do you think that they will, in theory, attack free agency in the draft as far as filling those roles and finding the right guys for Tom Cable to take over those positions? Do you think that they will approach it differently than they have the past few years because they haven't really been as successful as they would have hoped?
Yeah, I guess I'd say, first off, ask me in a couple of weeks when we've seen some free agency stuff, because I think no matter what happens, even if they re-sign Okung and Sweezy, we're going to see them address that to some degree in the draft. I mean, they've drafted at least one lineman every year. I think they've used 12 overall picks on linemen in 6 years, and they took 3 last year. So, will they add guys? Yeah, no matter what. But does it become more of a priority if you lose 1 or 2 starters? Sure. And, they like I think they like what they saw to Glowinski a lot. I think they'd feel pretty comfortable plugging him if they need to. What would happen at tackle without Okung? I don't know if you kick Britt back out and you move Gilliam. I don't know if you look to sign a guy in free agency, draft somebody who's ready to step right in. It's really hard to say, until we know what happens with those two pieces. But I guess just big picture, I think A, they're going to want to add guys no matter what happens, and B, whoever's there, I think they maybe will want to be a little more settled a little sooner if they can. They're not going to force it, but you've heard Pete Carroll and John Schneider and Tom Cable all be pretty candid about it. It didn't come together quite as quickly as they wanted. It did come together eventually, and it was pretty darn good the second half of the season, but I just don't think they want to go into a season where you run the risk of giving up 30 sacks in half a season and having times where the offense is just really struggling to function for really almost half a season.
And obviously all those things said with, we have to kind of wait and see what happens with free agency and all that. But apart from the offensive line, what are some other positional groups that you think are probably going to be a big focus for the Seahawks in the next couple of months?
I would say, again, because free agency could play a big factor, you have to look at the defensive line. I mean, we talked about Irvin earlier, and technically he's listed as a linebacker, but he fits into that pass rush rotation. So if he were to leave, you might want another pass rusher. Obviously, 2 of your starting defensive tackles are free agents, so maybe one's gone, maybe both are gone, maybe both are back. Let's wait and see on that. But to me, defensive line will be really interesting because that's one of the positions they've done best in free agency, of just finding, again, like I said earlier, finding the value where they're not necessarily in a bidding war next Tuesday to get a guy, but maybe 2-3 weeks from now, somebody's sitting out there and they can get them on a reasonable deal. So I look at both sides of the line kind of as probably the most obvious thing. And then, running back, I think we all feel pretty comfortable that Thomas Rawls is going to be the guy, but depth-wise, you don't know what's going to be there. I mean, Christian Michael's a restricted free agent. Fred Jackson's 35 and a free agent. So, and Marshawn Lynch is retiring. So there's not a lot really settled there other than Rawls. And then in secondary, especially cornerback, that was an unsettled spot opposite of Richard Sherman all year. I do think they still really like what they have in Deshaun Shedd, and he should be back. He's a exclusive rights free agent, is what I understand. So he'll be back, but you don't know about Jeremy Lane and whether those two are battling or someone else emerges. They've got a lot of those guys who are either on the practice squad or injured, or in the case of Ty Smith, just kind of learning as a rookie and not playing very often. There's a lot of talented guys that kind of fit the physical mold they like on the roster right now, but just a lot of unknowns, whether it's an injury with Harold Simon or just guys who haven't played enough to really know what they have, that maybe there's a future star already on the roster, but I don't know if you can just feel comfortable that one of those guys is ready to start week one if Jeremy Lane were to leave.
Right.
I guess, other sort of, news in the off season, and we don't know what's going to happen, and you can't speculate on any sort of contract situation with Michael Bennett, but he did switch agents, and it's going to be a question that looms on a lot of minds unless it is taken care of just sort of out of the blue. But I am kind of curious from your standpoint as a guy who covers the Seahawks and a media guy that's with these guys all the time and talking to these guys and knowing Michael Bennett. I mean, would you start a Kickstarter just to keep him on the team? Because from a personality standpoint, this seems like a guy that is just a gold mine for someone that covers the Seahawks. Do you is Michael Bennett just the best guy in the league to get to talk to all the time?
He's right up there. He's so entertaining, but it's interesting. I almost think sometimes his sense of humor is almost to his detriment in that I think he almost becomes like the class clown where people don't realize that he's also smart and a great player and all these other things, where that is a great entertaining part from a media standpoint. But we've seen him when he wants to be thoughtful and just, be serious about a topic, he can do that. But then just on the field, it's what he's done the last few years has been pretty incredible. And he was the best he's ever been this year. He was very honest. He didn't love his contract situation, but he showed up and he played as well as he ever has, still dealing with that toe thing. So, what's going to happen with him contract wise? I can't really say, one, because I don't know, and B, I can't really get into it, but assuming he's around next year, because he is under contract one way or another, I just think he's going to be a guy that will be great on the field and take care of his business no matter what happens off the field. But yeah, I mean, just everything about him has been really fun to be around and cover.
Speaking of that, kind of along those lines, what's the daily life like of the Seahawks beat reporter during the off season?
You know, it varies a lot, but as you guys well know, that I have friends all the time who don't pay close attention to him. They're like, "Oh, what do you do all off season?" There's nothing to do, but it's kind of like there's always something.
There's always news.
You know, you go from the combine to all the draft preview kind of stuff, and then you get into the draft, and you have free agency, and then boom, the draft's over, and off-season workouts are starting, and you're going to mini camps and OTAs. So, you get to catch your breath a little and slow down and take a little time off and all that. But there's always something going on. I mean, part of the reason we all have stuff to write about and people reading it is there's just kind of this insatiable, thirst for NFL content and knowledge, and people love the NFL right now, especially around here because the Seahawks have been so good. So you can't really produce too much content for these fans, which is great for us. And we just kind of keep trying to find interesting things, interesting angles to cover and write about. And then before we know it, we'll be back in full swing in July, and it feels like we haven't even barely blinked.
John Boyle, Seahawks.com. You can follow him on Twitter at John P. Boyle. Do a lot of people, have you gone by Boyle your whole life? I noticed that that Danny, he says he has talked to John, and I wasn't sure if he meant John Schneider. Have you had to go by Boyle most of the time?
Yeah, it's kind of usually, when I was a little kid, or when I was like in high school, I was always Little Boyle because I had an older brother there. But other than that, I was pretty much always just, most of my friends would call me Boyle, or I'll answer to whatever. I've got friends who call me John, Johnny. Not very many people call me Johnny. That's more a family thing. But I'm not too picky. I'm not one of those people that hate certain nicknames or anything like that.
Did you ever start chants of Boyle rules in high school?
Like from what is that? Billy Madison?
Yeah.
I did not.
Oh, okay.
What's the family? Is it O'Doyle in the movie?
Yeah, O'Doyle rules.
Yeah, no,
it's a bit of a stretch.
Yeah, if you have to explain the joke, it's a bad joke, and so sorry about that, everyone.
Yeah, no, that's it. I'm sure.
Little Bill, thank you. Thank you so much, John Boyle.
Yeah.
No problem.
For coming on the show. Follow him on Twitter, like I said, at John P. Boyle. And thank you so much, John.
No problem. Happy to do
it. Talk to you guys soon. All right, that was John. Good stuff.
Yes,
I mean,
he
kind of said some of the same things I said in terms of the combine. I think it was kind of a common thing is that there wasn't a lot of hype around, that much at the combine. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah. As far as the combine goes, I mean, there's not much else. I think, if anyone wants to hear more, listen to 3000 NFL Mock Draft. We had Danny on this week with myself and Rob talking about what he saw at the combine. We sort of go over, the players that sort of fit the Seahawks mold. I'm sure that at some point we'll have to talk to Zach Whitman again about what Spark scores came out or whatever. Those have a lot of predictive power as far as what the Seahawks are doing. They definitely do have a Spark score that they apply and use to players that they draft. Did you have any sort of? I haven't really paid attention. Is there a couple guys that have had a spark? Have those numbers been come out yet? That as far as who might be, Seahawks territory?
Yeah. So I'll kind of run through a few positions. I have access to Zach's Spark database. So it's one of the perks of the job. And he's as we go along in the off season, he's going to publish all these results, obviously. But kind of going through, guys to keep an eye on as potential Seahawks targets. Daniel Lasco out of California ended up being a 94th percentile athlete at the draft. He kind of was injured, at the combine. He was kind of injured last year. Had, I think, a hip issue and some other things that kind of limited him. But he at he's 6 foot 209. He ran a 4.46 40. Really good 10-yard split of 1.53. Jumped 41.5 inches and had a broad jump of 11 feet and whatever is a quarter. He's puts these in decimals, but 11.25 feet. So he's a guy to keep an eye on. Obviously, Derrick Henry blew up the combine with his numbers. But Lasco was kind of the standout in terms of running backs. Moving to wide receiver, Josh Dotson out of TCU was the top performer. But then Ricardo Lewis out of Auburn did really well. And so he's kind of a lesser-known guy, but kind of a gadgety type player. But he's a guy to keep in mind. Obviously, with Ricardo Lockett probably not coming back next year, they love guys with a lot of speed, and this guy ran a 4.43 with a really good vertical, 38-inch vertical, 11-foot broad. Let's see, moving down the line. I think there was a couple of really good cornerbacks to keep an eye on. Obviously, Jalen Ramsey, the big one. DJ White out of Georgia Tech, though he's probably too small for the Seahawks. And then two guys that are big enough, it would seem, are DeAndre Hall from Northern Iowa and DeAndre Elliott from Colorado State. So keep those guys in mind too. But yeah, as I said, Zach will probably start publishing these at his website pretty soon. So we'll get to talk about some of these guys that stood out in the Spark score soon. The other thing to talk about, I don't know if you saw this, but as we were recording, Adam Schefter tweeted that Jermaine Kearse reiterated Thursday he does not plan to return to Seattle and is looking forward to finding a new home. What do you think of that, Kenny?
I mean, I think what I'm going to say. I've been very adamant, A, that I don't think Jermaine Kearse is going to come back, and B, that that I think that he is a fine player, but certainly not one that needs to be paid several $1 million per year. I think that, and I've said from the beginning, I think that he could get that somewhere else. That the Seahawks shouldn't, because they don't have a need for him as much throughout the regular season. He does, very little, but he does come up with a few big catches here and there. And I think that if it wasn't Jermaine Kearse, it'll be somebody else. It's not the biggest loss. And I do think, he can go somewhere else and have a really, nice career. I think that, the Atlanta Falcons are looking for someone, and Dan Quinn's there. So maybe the Falcons.
I could definitely see that, I could see him. What if he ended up on like the Patriots or something like that? Because they just cut like all their receivers.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense too.
I was going to look through the free agents right now. Like, what would you think of? And this obviously everything depends on money, but I want to run through a few guys real quick. I want to just give me like a yes or no quick answer. Anquan Bolden.
No.
Marcus Colston.
No.
Roddy White.
No.
Brandon LaFell.
No.
Brian Quick.
Yes.
Yes. All right, we got a yes. Mohamed Sanu.
Yes.
Let's see here. Ruben Randall.
No.
Marvin Jones.
No.
Okay, and that's probably about as far as we need to go. Then you kind of get into some way lower level dudes. But, I mean, it does kind of give you an idea. There's quite a few free agents out there, but there's really not any, like, top level ones. I think that's probably why Kearse is like, I'm going to go get paid because, I mean, he's competing with, a few washed up guys, a few, guys that really underwhelmed on their first contract, like Brian Quick, for instance.
Rashard Matthews of the Dolphins is a very interesting player.
He's definitely interesting, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a guy that, is a little bit underrated, perhaps one of the better players on the Dolphins offense last year, and, nobody's really talking about him. So Rashard Matthews might be a guy that they could see if he's going to fall into that mold where, because he's not a big name, like John Boyle was mentioning, that they wait maybe a few weeks and see which guys may feel devalued. And I think if Matthews gets to that point, maybe they sign him to a 2-year deal or something like that. Because I think that's a guy that might fit well.
I think that I like the Sanu one. I personally just think that's interesting. I think he's a tough, bigger guy, physical, just kind of seems to fit the Seahawks mold. I think it's always hard, I think, for the Seahawks because they, the second half of Russell Wilson's season last year will definitely help. But I've always said, like, if you're a big name receiver, you're not going to come to Seattle. Or if you want to make a name for yourself, you're not going to come to Seattle, because this is kind of where receivers go to die, or it has been. But, you know, with Doug Baldwin's year last year, I think that will definitely help things in terms of that. So I don't know. It's definitely.
No, Sanu was one of my favorite receivers in the draft that he was in. And I'm assuming 2012. And I remember just thinking very highly of him at the time. I think that his career has been, you know, very hit and miss, nothing super consistent. But at the same time, maybe, you know, like I said with Mina last week, I think that there are guys that have just they have the same amount of talent. I don't think there is a lot of improvement done once you get to a certain age, but I do think that in the right scheme, you can show your full potential. So that's sort of there are guys that are being underutilized or not utilized in the right way, that been putting in a situation like the situation that Bennett was put in when he came to the Seahawks to play the position with the guys that he was. I think he was always sort of that type of player, but in the right position to do it, he could show that he was one of the best players in the NFL. So a guy like Sanu, maybe, I mean, it's hard to say that you're not in a good situation when you've got Andy Dalton and AJ Green and Marvin Jones, you know, sort of helping you out. But, you know, maybe there is something that'll just work better. Plus, you know, I don't think that they're looking for a guy to be the guy. They're just looking for a guy, you know, to be the number 3 guy. And I think that exactly, you know, if he fits in and if he slides in like that, then great. But, you know, at the same time, as far as receiver goes, Jermaine Kearse leaves. I don't think that they will this season invest a whole lot in the receiver position, maybe a 5th or 6th round pick, but I don't see them making any big moves at receiver. I think they like Doug Baldwin, Tyler Lockett, the return of Jimmy Graham. I think they like Kason Williams and Kevin Smith, and maybe they just throw another guy in there because they don't think they need to get too crazy this time around, right?
Right. I kind of would agree with you. I mean, in terms of where you're putting money, I really doubt that they'll put a whole lot at the receiver position. Maybe like a guy that is, you know, near the league minimum, where you sign a guy to a multi-year deal with like really low cap hits in the first year. But agreed. I mean, you still have Paul Richardson coming back, so he's kind of an X factor. Like you said, Jimmy Graham's coming back, so I don't think they're going to invest a whole lot in the receiver position personally. I think they have, you know, bigger fish to fry in terms of the offensive line, defensive line, secondary. And so, yeah, I think that's probably pretty spot on. Obviously, and I'd rather have them spend money on like a defensive pass rusher. I would way rather see them do that than spend money on a receiver, just based on the history of this offense. So, yeah, I'm not surprised by the Kearse news. It was kind of weird how Adam Schefter worded it, where he said he reiterated Thursday. I don't remember him saying this before. I mean, Kearse did say something along the lines of he's not going to give a hometown discount, but I don't know. That was a little bit odd way to word it. I wanted to talk to you. You had a article today that matched every team with the perfect free agent. Number one, that was over on Sports on Earth, but that's up at Field Goals. Number one, who is the one that you matched with the Seahawks? And kind of for people who haven't read that, kind of tease that out, and then we can talk about some other free agents that you might find interesting.
All right, let me pull it up so that I can remember all of my answers. I do believe I remember who I put to the Seahawks, even though, you know, this is probably not possible so much. But there are also Seahawks that I think matched up well with other teams. You know, Kelechi Osemele is a guy that can play guard and tackle. He played left tackle for the Ravens sometimes. I could see him being, you know, probably the Seahawks' number 1 target for the offseason for that reason, you know, especially if they don't resign Okung. You know, I think that there's good reason for them to maybe take a look and see if they can at least get him in for an interview, find out what kind of a guy he is, and find out how much money he might be asking for him and his agent. And they might decide that, you know, he's a better signing than Russell Okung. So if they don't re-sign Russell Okung, I think they should, you know, very well have. If they have money for Okung, they have money for Osemele. You know, if it's not going to be one, it could be the other. And I think that there's still money that could be freed up probably here and there. You know, they've got, you know, something like $30 million in cap room, I think, as it is, without re-signing their players and with Marshawn Lynch leaving. So Osemele would probably be the number one target because he might be able to play left tackle. What are your thoughts?
I mean, yeah, I think he's really highly respected as an offensive lineman, and I think with the way that John Schneider probably looks up to Ozzie Newsome over in Baltimore, I think that might have a factor and could factor into their evaluation a little bit. I think it is kind of risky if he's not a left tackle. I mean, obviously did he play like 4 games at left tackle or something like that this year?
Something like that.
Yeah. So I mean, there's definitely a little bit of a projection there. So that would be.
But even still, if he wants to get paid as a guard, and if you're talking about, you could possibly see, if you're paying him as a guard, you say, look, you're going to be our starting left guard. We'll move Britt to right guard. Then you'll be our starting left guard, and you sign him at guard money, which maybe that's $8 or $9 million per year, as opposed to left tackle, which is maybe $11 or $12 million per year at the premier end. Maybe you sign him for that sort of $8.5, $9 million or whatever, and then you put him at guard, and then you lose Okung, and then you just sort of try it out in camp, and you see if he can hold up at left tackle. I think that just the fact, plus the fact that even if they had someone else at left tackle that they liked or whatever, and they got hurt, they've had problems, with Russell Okung getting injured every year, where they've had to throw in an Alvin Bailey or something like that, and it just hasn't looked that great. So just the flexibility and the fact that he is probably a premier guard, he gets overshadowed on the Ravens because they have, probably the best guard in the NFL. So that he sort of never got the opportunity to be the best guard on a team and play that left side because of Marshall Yanda. So here he is now as a free agent, and certainly a guy that I think and I mentioned Alex Mack as well. He's probably too expensive also. But again, if they don't sign Okung, at least having a center that's an elite center that you have snapping to Russell Wilson, blocking up the middle, Alex Mack is certainly an ideal option, even if he's not affordable.
I agree. I think, that's an interesting thing. I wanted to, a couple other highlights from your article I thought were interesting. Robert Griffin obviously going to the Rams. I think that would be pretty interesting. What do you think about that situation?
Yeah, I mean, they need a quarterback. They can't. I don't think they can go with Nick Foles. I mean, obviously they're going to have him there, and Nick Foles is going to be one of the guys perhaps fighting for the job or whatever, and that's something because they can't really get rid of him. There's no savings to be had. So Robert Griffin to me is a guy that hasn't played by the time next season starts, will have not played in almost 2 years. In 2012 was one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. Then as sort of 13 and 14 struggled. I think that if he was a healthy player in 2015, I think he could have benefited from some of those same things that Kirk Cousins benefited from and had a good year. I think that he is a good passer that was not necessarily only valuable because of his legs in the way that a Michael Vick might be. I think that Griffin is still a better player than, say, a Tyrod Taylor, who I like a lot. And Tyrod Taylor, just had a very good season for the Bills, and he had a small 2-year contract. So if Robert Griffin is actually going to fly under the radar, and if he goes to the Rams and he's playing in Los Angeles, and if they try and upgrade, because I don't know what their identity on offense is going to be, because like we said, Brian Quick is a free agent. They've got Tavon Austin, or Kenny Britt is a free agent. I don't know what they're all going to be. They cut their Cook. They're going to obviously need to find some type of number one receiver. So like if they sign a quarterback like a Robert Griffin, then maybe they draft a Laquan Treadwell or Corey Coleman, and then their offense looks a lot better now that they got Todd Gurley. Griffin with Gurley and all, it was very interesting. He's a much better option than I think Chase Daniel, Brock Osweiler, Ryan Fitzpatrick, maybe Colin Kaepernick. Griffin in the NFC West would be something to behold, but then again, maybe he'll never recover from that injury. What about you?
I think it would be really interesting. I kind of agree that if he was given kind of the Tyrod Taylor treatment and given a couple of years to kind of get back on track, I think that he could have some potential still. Obviously, the knee injuries have really just derailed his career. So, and I mean, it doesn't help to be in kind of a dysfunctional organization like Washington. Obviously, they're a little bit better this year, but I think, over the last couple of years, things have been kind of crazy in that area. So I think it's definitely interesting. Of course, the Rams aren't exactly a picture of function either. And, with Jeff Fisher still in charge, and they were the worst offense in the NFL last year. So maybe it's not necessarily a great landing spot for him, where he's going to maybe have to kind of be the guy rather than going to an offense that has a lot of talent already. So, but regardless, I think it's a really interesting scenario, and it'll be really cool to see where he lands, because I think teams probably haven't completely given up on him at this point. And as long as he's willing to go in and kind of rehab his whole image and world outlook, I think he'd probably be okay. Because, I think he ran into some issues with being like overconfident and stuff like that in Washington. So we'll see. One more interesting one from your article, you have Bruce Irvin going to the 49ers, which would be really interesting. Do you think he would leave? I mean, do you think that they would throw a lot of money at Bruce?
Well, the 49ers are interesting because they have $50 or $60 million in the cap. They don't have very many good players. They didn't have anybody with more than 6.5 sacks last season. So I think, Bruce Irvin, I still don't necessarily know that if I believe that he has the potential to be a 12 or 13 sack guy, but I do know that he is a very good player. I know that the 49ers need guys that can cause turnovers, and he has had a knack for that, I think. Yeah. I think if you put him next to Navarro Bowman, and I guess Ahmad Brooks and some of their other young linebackers, there is a fit there. I'm not so great at schemes or whatever, but I think that if you have a good player, an athletic player, I do see similarities in the athleticism of a guy like Bowman to the athleticism of a guy like Irvin. So I think the 49ers would find a place for him, and they just need better players. And because they're the 49ers, maybe they're a little bit more attractive to a team than the Oakland Raiders or the Jacksonville Jaguars, who have more money available, but, may not necessarily be able to offer more money just because, there's only so much you can offer a guy. So, if they were deciding between the Raiders, Jaguars, and 49ers, wouldn't you, a lot of people I think would choose the 49ers, though the Raiders, seem to be a team on the way up. The Jaguars, if I were, logically thinking as a player or as an agent, I would look at the Jaguars and I'd say, well, that division is terrible, and the Jaguars have like $83 million in cap room, which is not an exaggeration.
Ridiculous.
They have 2,000-yard receivers. They've got a good young quarterback. They've got a lot of potential there. And, so you got Gus Bradley. Maybe this is going to be his year, but, the 49ers, if they can take Bruce Irvin away from the Seahawks, maybe it puts a little bit more fuel in that rivalry. But and I know it would definitely piss off some Seahawks fans to see Bruce playing for the enemy. What do you think?
Well, yeah, I think it's an interesting fit for them because I think he kind of would fit their mold of outside linebacker. Like if you look at some of the guys they have right now, Aaron Lynch, he's a little bit bigger and heavier than Irvin, but I mean, not by a lot. He's listed here at 249. I don't know if he bulked up a lot last year, but Aaron Lynch, maybe he's not the best. But then you have guys like Eli Harold and Corey Lemonnier, or Lemonwa, however the hell you say his name. Those guys really comp to him a little bit, in speed, athleticism, kind of like a longer outside linebacker type guy that can both rush and drop. So I think the fit would work. I think he would work in a 3-4. He's got the athleticism for it. He's got the versatility to, take on runs on the strong side, which he did for the Seahawks, and then also kind of drop into space and be athletic enough to do that, and rush passer. So yeah, I think he's kind of scheme versatile in that sense. So it'll be really interesting to see where he ends up. It kind of feels like a foregone conclusion at this point that he's gone from the Seahawks, just because
some of these other.
Yeah, they won't be able to afford him. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think, I've made my predictions, I think, for most of the big names. I said that, the Seahawks would have to do something with Michael Bennett, and, I think things are happening there. I said that I didn't think Okung or Sweezy or Irvin would come back, or Jermaine Kearse either. I didn't think they would come back, and it looks like those are all perhaps going to come to fruition. I said they'd re-sign Jeremy Lane, and you know, and I think that's kind of come to pass, but we'll see. You know, I said they would. I think that because, you know, I don't think that people are really they're not really looking at the fact that he has not played in his career very much. And so there are a lot of questions with Jeremy Lane. In my article, I posted him to the Jets, you know, a team that has Todd Bowles there, a great secondary coach, needs better cornerbacks. They cut Antonio Cromartie. You know, they spent all this money on Revis and Skrine and Cromartie. They've got a couple more, you know, like they've got all these cornerbacks that they've drafted and everything, but none of them really worked out except for Darrell Revis and Jeremy Lane. Maybe, you know, this will be his opportunity to be a starter somewhere. What are your thoughts on Jeremy Lane? You know, do you think that he will be able to play? Do you think he's ready? Or, you know, there's so many questions about Seahawks cornerbacks going somewhere else. What do you think, if you were to predict the future of Jeremy Lane on another team, what would you think would happen?
Yeah, Jeremy Lane's the tough one, I think, because it's hard to know how the free agent cornerback market's going to play out this year. I think based on last year, where a lot of guys got paid a lot of money and none of them really panned out the way that teams were hoping. I wonder if that will make teams gun shy this year a little bit. But then again, there's not a lot of top tier corners out there right now. So the lower tier, not necessarily lower tier, but middle tier guys kind of like Lane might get overpaid because there's just not a lot of inventory out there in terms of good cornerbacks. So it's kind of an interesting thing. I don't know. I really don't have a good idea of it because you've talked in the past about how maybe he'll get like a 1 year prove-it deal. And that is totally plausible to me. But at the same time, it's also plausible that he'll get way overpaid just based on, you know, the fact that there's not a lot of demand or there is a lot of demand right now for corners and not a lot of supply. So it'll be really interesting. I think
you got
in a regular year, what you're saying, he doesn't have a ton of experience. He's missed a lot of games. I think that's totally true. So you're kind of paying him for what he's going to become rather than what he already is, which I think is what you want to do.
That's what you want to, you know, like you want to, you know, like the Seahawks don't really do that. They had a lot of faith in Cliff Averill and Michael Bennett, but they didn't give them big deals when they first signed them. They said, Bennett, you get a 1 year, $4.5 million deal. Averill, you get a 2 year, $10 million deal or whatever it is. You know, they were playing it safe. And I think where teams sometimes get in trouble, I mean, look at some of these guys that are getting cut right now, you know, 1-2 years into a deal that was 5 years long or whatever. Sam Bradford getting, you know, $40 million and $26 million guaranteed. It's like for nothing. I mean, they're paying him for nothing he's done and everything that they hope that he will do. And I don't think that would be the way to go. You know, I see a lot of guys here on the free agent market that have a lot of potential, I think, and would be the perfect guys, like John was saying, if you know, to wait a little bit and see if they're still available and see if they, you know, aren't getting the offers that they want because they think they're worth more based on their potential. You know, I'm curious, what are your thoughts on the Colts tight ends? I know the Seahawks aren't really looking for a tight end, though they may need someone in the beginning of the year if Jimmy Graham starts out on PUP. Certainly there could be some, you know, insurance there. You know, I think it's very possible that we'll start with Luke Wilson in the beginning of the year. Anthony McCoy is a free agent or whatever. You know, Chase Coleman is older than like Jimmy Graham is a free agent. What are your thoughts on Dwayne Allen and Kobe Fleener? Which one would you prefer?
I think I'd rather have Dwayne Allen. I just think he's kind of a more complete player. That said, I think Kobe Fleener's a good player too. I think he had some issues with drops in his career, but I mean, I think you kind of said it. I don't think the Seahawks are probably going to spend a lot of money at the tight end position unless they let Jimmy Graham go, which I still don't think is I don't think that's going to happen, at least not right away. So I don't know. I think this is kind of a boring answer to your question, but I think the Seahawks are probably just going to do the Seahawk thing and like try and get one of their practice squad players to be like an effective, like, you know, they've got what's his face, the guy that Cooper Helton. Yeah, they got Rashawn Allen, Cooper Helfet. They'd signed some new guy to their futures contract. They, potentially could go to like you said, Anthony McCoy or one of these other guys that'll do like a league minimum style contract and just come in and block or whatever. But if they did end up going into free agency, there are a couple that I like. I definitely like Dwayne Allen. And the other guy that I like is Ladarius Green from the Chargers. He is a guy that I heard the Seahawks really liked in the draft, and the Chargers took him right before the Seahawks had a chance to pick him. Or the report is they were going to pick him, but who knows? With these things. Jared Cook is another guy that's free agent. There's probably a few guys to be had in terms of like low end veteran deals. Mercedes Lewis is out there. Looks like Jermaine Gresham is out there. Not that he'll necessarily be at the very low end, but Scott Chandler just got released. Benjamin Watson's a guy that's out there. So I think that
Jermaine Gresham's an interesting guy. He seems like he's like one of these rare type of players that I could see like not getting a deal the same year he made the Pro Bowl. Like,
right?
I don't know how he's like a 2-time Pro Bowl or something like that.
Did he make the Pro Bowl this year?
I think so. Or he has been to the Pro Bowl, and I think it's mostly because of the tight end position. It's just sort of a weird one where if enough guys don't good. He was a Pro Bowler in 2011 and 2012. Okay. He actually played for the Cardinals last year. Didn't even know that. I don't recall him playing. Like I don't remember any things. He had 18 catches for 223 yards and a touchdown in 15 games, playing in the Cardinals offense. So I could sort of see him actually being on that low end. Jermaine Gresham's career. He's only, he was only 27 last year. He's still 27 now. He turns 28 in June. But yeah, former first round pick that is just sort of nondescript and not really, I would say like just I couldn't tell you any Jermaine Gresham plays or anything like that. Just very forgettable.
Right. Yeah.
Some other guys, I've got here Russell Okung going to the Chargers, or at least that would be good for the Chargers because, the worst running team in the NFL, just about pretty much, 32nd in yards per carry. And Okung, a great blocking left tackle. And the Chargers have some money to spend, and they need someone to not only protect Phillip Rivers, but to open up some holes for Melvin Gordon, who they used their 15th overall pick on last year. What were you putting the odds on percentage-wise of Russell Okung leaving?
Leaving? Probably I think I would say 75% chance that he'll leave. Mm-hmm. I think we talked about this a little bit. I think that the whole representing yourself thing is a big wild card, and I think it's probably not a good thing for the Seahawks that he's doing that because he has a lot to prove. So he has. I think in order for him to not for him to not lose face in front of his peers and the players and everything like that, I think he has to feel like he got a really, really good deal for himself. You know what I mean? And so I don't see him taking some sort of hometown discount or anything that looks like reasonable in terms of what the Seahawks might be willing to give him. I think he's going for big money, flashy, something or other. And he's at a position where he could probably do it even if he doesn't deserve it. You know what I mean? So someone's going to pay him too much, I think is my point. And I don't think it's going to be the
for
Seahawks.
sure. It's the market.
Yeah.
And to make it to the market, I put him still. When I did it, I put him at a Brandon Albert deal. I think he is just as valuable as Brandon Albert. There's a lot of comparisons to be made, and Albert was about 5 years, $50 million. Maybe he gets more than that because of the differing market and the fact that he will hit free agency. An interesting other guy, the Seahawks 2012 draft includes Bruce Irvin and Russell Wilson and J.R. Sweezy, but it also includes Jay Howard, who did not work out with the Seahawks. Right. But for the last 2 years has been one of the Chiefs' best players on defense. Sort of forgotten, and he got away from the Seattle Seahawks. As far as how that all transpired, is it whether injury and how much they really hated having to let him go. I'm not sure, but he's a free agent. I think he could get a lot of money on the market. Where do you think that Jay Howard sort of fits best? Is there any scenario where the Seahawks are able to talk to him?
Nah, probably not. I think there's probably a reason they got rid of him. Not that being said, I mean, they probably regret getting rid of him at this point. But what I had heard when the reason they released him is because he was like freelancing too much, which is like a terrible thing to do in the Seahawks defense, where they're like really, really concerned about being really disciplined and all that. Obviously, he could have figured that out, but I don't know. It would seem real weird if they ended up paying him a whole bunch of money to come back, but it's not out of the realm of possibility if they see him kind of as a 3-tech or whatever. My guess is he'll probably end up in a 3-4 though again, kind of doing what he does like he does in Kansas City. So I doubt. I think the odds of that happening are pretty low, but I wouldn't rule it out at this point. I just think if anything, it's more like just a damn it. Like we could have had this guy for cheap for 2 years, but
yeah, I mean, imagine Jay Howard if he had managed to do the right things or whatever and stay healthy.
Yeah.
Imagine him on the 2013, 2014 Seahawks. It's been 2015. If that was the 2 times they fell short, how much different would they have been if they had Jay Howard instead of I don't know, Cassius Marsh or something like that. I love Cassius Marsh, but Jay Howard, as far as the positions he plays for the Chiefs, the Chiefs, when they really look at them, they really are like the Seahawks of the AFC, aren't they?
Style-wise, they definitely are, yeah. In terms of they have a suffocating defense, kind of a ball control offense, and try and control the clock and all that. So, yeah, I think so. I think they play a different scheme, obviously. I don't think that Alex Smith is as good as Russell Wilson. Do you remember when we were having that argument with Chiefs fans in the preseason? I don't know if you remember that. For a while, it looked like maybe they were right, but Russell Wilson really turned it on in the second half, obviously, and
there's no sort of Russell Wilson inside of Alex Smith anywhere. I mean, Alex Smith is a very good player, but there is no Russell Wilson in him. He'll never hit that level of really being able to take over a game, really being able to keep you in every game, really, hitting those marks where, he throws 24 touchdowns and 1 interception. Like even Alex Smith, who had gone like 9 straight games without throwing an interception, he could never do it with the amount of volume and touchdowns and offense that Russell Wilson could do with allowing the same number of, still controlling the ball, not turning it over, and still producing, all of the offense. There is no Alex Smith. Alex Smith doesn't have that in him. He's limited in that respect, despite being a very athletic and good player and a good option quarterback and all that. But definitely no Russell Wilson and never will be. And yeah, it's interesting. The Chiefs could lose a good cornerback in Sean Smith. They franchised Eric Berry. They've got Tamba Ali in free agency now. And Derek Johnson, surprisingly, not a lot of people talk about Derek Johnson hitting free agency, but he's been with the team for seems like 10 years maybe or something. So we'll see if how much the Chiefs change basically over this time. But it's nice to feel like, oh, you might be similar to the Chiefs, but you managed to do that in a way that produced Super Bowls and a championship. So it didn't work out in the same way for the Chiefs, and I don't know exactly how I feel about them next year. It's interesting, we'll see what happens. I don't, free agency and the draft, they definitely change things, but at the same time, could you really point to free agency as the reason that can you point to last year's free agency as the reason that the Broncos and the Panthers won their conferences? There are moves that they made, but I don't think you could point to anything that they did that led directly to their appearance in the Super Bowl. I think you could, point to 2 years down the line and 3 years down the line. But the things that are happening now, like the Panthers last year added Kurt Coleman, which was a very low-key move, not something that people were really talking about before or after. And then he had 7 interceptions. The Broncos, they added, I don't know, I can't even think of a person. I'm sure there was probably 1 or 2, but like Owen Daniels or something like that. I can't really think of huge names. But if you go back to 2012, they added Peyton Manning. And if you go back to 14 or whatever they added DeMarcus Ware, and there's definitely things that happened, but it took 2 years, 3 years for it to really all come to fruition. So what the Seahawks do now, will it change? It's not really about the guys they had now. It's about Russell Wilson and Earl Thomas and Richard Sherman and Michael Bennett, right?
Yeah, definitely. It's about the core, and you can find a guy in free agency to add to it, but I don't think the idea of like you're one guy away necessarily applies in this situation. I think at this point it would just be like adding something to what they've already got, not necessarily putting them over the top or whatever. So yeah, this is an interesting free agency overall, though. I'm really intrigued by it. And it's kind of like the draft. I think, how John said, it's not necessarily like top heavy, but kind of deep. I feel like free agency is a little bit like that too. There's kind of a lot of guys that could come in and be like solid contributors. So I don't think the Seahawks are going to go out and spend big money outside free agency. Maybe to get one of their guys back, they'll spend a lot of money. But I think there's probably going to be more. It's going to be more interesting in the mid-level stuff, like just contributors.
Yeah, I think we'll see what happens. Well, by the time this happens next week, I think we'll have a lot more to say about free agency. Teams can't sign players officially until the 15th, but by around the 7th, they can start talking, and that's sort of when news trickles out about who's going to go where. So I think that that'll be a good episode of Reel and Field Goals next week. We'll have more to talk about with Russell Okung, and not directly with Russell Okung, about Russell Okung, and Jermaine Kearse and all these other guys. Over the next few weeks, a lot of news is going to come out. So subscribe to Reel and the Field Goals on iTunes. Follow on Twitter at Field Goals. Tell friends about it. Talk to your friends about the Seahawks. Follow Little Boyle at John P. Boyle on Twitter as well. Thank you, John, for coming on the show. And that's it. Until then, keep on keeping it real into the field.